The avoidant operates under the comfortable assumption that your love is a renewable resource, that your attention will remain perpetually available regardless of how poorly they treat it, and that your investment in the relationship provides them with permanent security while requiring no reciprocal effort on their part. They build their entire relationship strategy around the belief that they can withdraw, withhold, and emotionally neglect you indefinitely while you remain frozen in place, waiting for scraps of their affection like a loyal dog, hoping for table scraps from an indifferent master. But something shifts in the psychological landscape when you stop caring, when your pursuit ends not in dramatic confrontation, but in quiet indifference, when your emotional investment evaporates and leaves them holding nothing but the memory of power they can no longer wield. The avoidant who has spent months or years taking your devotion for granted suddenly discovers they've been playing a game where the other player has not only left the field, but found a better game entirely. This realization triggers a psychological crisis that cuts deeper than rejection, abandonment, or even betrayal. It's the devastating recognition that they have become irrelevant, that their presence or absence no longer affects your emotional temperature, that the person who once organized their entire existence around securing their attention has found sources of satisfaction that don't include them. Your indifference becomes their worst nightmare made manifest, proof that they are not as essential, as powerful, or as irreplaceable as their ego required them to believe. The moment when an avoidant realizes you truly don't care anymore represents the collapse of their fundamental worldview about relationships, power, and their own significance in other people's lives, forcing them to confront the possibility that their emotional unavailability has cost them something genuinely valuable that cannot be recovered through their usual manipulation tactics. The moment their control strategy backfires. The avoidant's entire relationship approach depends on maintaining strategic emotional distance that keeps their partner in a state of perpetual pursuit, where their scarcity creates artificial value and their withdrawal generates increased investment from someone desperate to bridge the gap they deliberately create. This control strategy operates like a sophisticated psychological manipulation, where they regulate their partner's emotional temperature through calculated availability, ensuring they remain the pursued party while never risking the vulnerability of genuine investment or reciprocal emotional labor. The backfire occurs when their strategic withdrawal finally pushes past their partner's breaking point, when the person who has been chasing them for months or years suddenly stops running and discovers the relief that comes with ending their participation in a rigged game. The avoidance distance, which was designed to increase their value through scarcity, instead teaches their partner to find satisfaction elsewhere, creating the very abandonment they were trying to prevent through their sophisticated emotional management techniques. Understanding this backfire means recognizing that the avoidance control strategy contains the seeds of its own destruction, as the emotional distance designed to maintain power eventually creates enough space for their partner to realize they deserve better treatment and can find happiness that doesn't depend on someone who treats love like a limited resource to be rationed rather than a gift to be shared freely between willing participants. The moment of backfire typically occurs without warning or dramatic confrontation, as the avoidant continues their usual pattern of withdrawal and strategic unavailability, only to discover that their partner has stopped responding with the expected pursuit, anxiety, or attempts to restore connection. The silence that greets their manipulation tactics feels different, not angry or hurt, but genuinely indifferent to their emotional games and power plays. This realization creates profound disorientation for the avoidant, who has organized their entire identity around being the one who doesn't need anyone, the one who holds power through emotional distance, the one who can withdraw safely, knowing their partner will work to restore connection. When their withdrawal is met with matching withdrawal rather than increased pursuit, their fundamental assumptions about relationship dynamics and their own power within those dynamics collapse completely. The backfire becomes most devastating when the avoidant recognizes that their control strategy has trained their partner to expect disappointment, to find satisfaction through self-sufficiency, and to stop investing emotional energy in someone who treats their care as burdensome obligation rather than precious gift. They discover they've created exactly the kind of person they claim to want, independent and unneedy. But only after that person has redirected their independence away from the relationship entirely. Most significantly, the backfire reveals the fundamental flaw in the avoidance control strategy. It assumes their partner's investment is inexhaustible, that their patience is unlimited, that their capacity to tolerate emotional neglect is permanent. When these assumptions prove false, when their partner's caring finally reaches its natural expiration date, the avoidant finds themselves powerless to restore connection through the very tactics that destroyed it. The control strategy backfire also eliminates the avoidant's ability to maintain their comfortable role as the emotionally superior party who graciously tolerates their partner's needy attachment. When their partner stops being needy, stops trying to earn their attention, the avoidant loses their primary source of ego validation and relationship power, discovering they've become ordinary rather than special, replaceable rather than essential. Understanding this backfire explains why avoidants often experience panic and desperation when their emotional distance finally achieves its natural consequence of creating actual distance, rather than the artificial scarcity they intended to maintain. They discover too late that their control strategy was actually a slow-motion relationship suicide that they mistook for sophisticated emotional management. The tragic irony lies in how the avoidants attempt to control their partner through strategic unavailability eventually creates the very outcome they most feared: genuine loss of someone who once loved them but learned to live without them through the emotional independence their control strategy inadvertently taught them to develop. Panic. When the chaser becomes the walker. The psychological terror that grips the avoidant when their pursuer transforms into someone walking away represents a complete reversal of their fundamental assumptions about relationship power dynamics and their own irresistible value in other people's lives. This role reversal triggers existential panic because it forces them to confront the possibility that they are not as essential, as fascinating, or as worth fighting for as their ego has required them to believe throughout their adult relationship history. The panic emerges from the avoidant's sudden recognition that they have been operating under false assumptions about their partner's emotional resilience and investment capacity, believing that someone who loved them deeply would continue that pursuit indefinitely, regardless of how little encouragement or reciprocity they provided. When the chaser stops chasing, the avoidant discovers they've lost not just a relationship, but their primary source of validation about their own desirability and power over others. Understanding this panic means recognizing that the avoidant has never learned to pursue, has never developed the emotional skills necessary to win someone back, has never had to work for love that was freely given until they destroyed it through emotional neglect and strategic unavailability. They find themselves in completely unfamiliar territory where they must provide effort, vulnerability, and genuine investment to restore connection with someone who no longer requires their attention for happiness. The transformation from chaser to walker represents the avoidant's worst nightmare because it eliminates their comfortable position of being desired without having to desire in return, of being pursued without having to pursue, of receiving emotional investment without providing reciprocal care. When their partner stops playing the role of emotional supplicant, the avoidant must either learn new relationship skills or accept the loss of someone they took for granted. This panic often manifests as desperate attempts to restore the familiar dynamic where they hold power through scarcity, while their partner provides effort through pursuit. But these attempts typically fail because someone who has learned to walk away has already processed the disappointment and found peace with the relationship's limitations. The avoidant sudden interest often feels too little, too late to someone who has already grieved the loss and moved forward. The role reversal panic also includes the terrifying recognition that their partner's indifference might be permanent rather than temporary manipulation designed to provoke their attention. When someone genuinely stops caring rather than strategically withdrawing to create artificial scarcity, the avoidant faces the possibility that no amount of effort can restore what they've destroyed through months or years of emotional unavailability and defensive relationship patterns. Most devastatingly, the panic reveals the avoidant's hidden dependency on their partner's pursuit, exposing how much their self-worth depended on being wanted by someone whose care they consistently minimized and devalued. When that pursuit ends, they discover an emotional void that their independence was supposed to protect them from ever experiencing, forcing them to confront their own attachment needs at the worst possible moment. The panic becomes most acute when the avoidant realizes their usual tactics for managing relationships, withdrawal, emotional distance, strategic unavailability, are not only ineffective, but actually counterproductive when dealing with someone who has learned to find satisfaction elsewhere. They must learn entirely new emotional skills at precisely the moment when their attachment wounds make vulnerability feel most dangerous and terrifying. Understanding this panic explains why avoidants often become most emotionally available and expressive just as their relationships are ending, when their defensive strategies have finally succeeded in pushing away someone whose love could have healed their attachment wounds if they had been capable of receiving it when it was freely offered, rather than desperately trying to restore it after it's been withdrawn. The transformation from chaser to walker ultimately forces the avoidant to confront their fundamental relationship cowardice, their emotional immaturity, and their profound need for the very intimacy they've spent their adult life avoiding through sophisticated defense mechanisms that protected them from vulnerability while ensuring they would never experience genuine love or lasting satisfaction. The desperate pursuit of someone who's moved on. The avoidant's transformation into a pursuer represents a complete psychological reversal that triggers every attachment wound they've spent their adult life avoiding, forcing them to experience the vulnerability, desperation, and emotional exposure they've witnessed in others with a mixture of contempt and terror. When they find themselves chasing someone who no longer responds to their attention, they discover the excruciating powerlessness of needing someone who doesn't need them back, of wanting connection with someone who has found peace in disconnection. This desperate pursuit manifests through behaviors they've always scorned in others: excessive texting, emotional declarations, promises of change, and attempts to negotiate their way back into someone's heart through logic, manipulation, or raw emotional appeal. The avoidant, who once prided themselves on never begging, never chasing, never appearing desperate, suddenly finds themselves embodying every relationship behavior they've criticized as weak, needy, or pathetically dependent on another person's validation. Understanding this pursuit reveals the profound irony that the avoidant only learns to fight for love after they've destroyed it, only develops appreciation for someone's value after losing access to it, only discovers their capacity for emotional effort when that effort can no longer achieve its intended goal. They become everything they once despised in their partners at precisely the moment when such transformation serves no purpose except their own psychological torment. The desperation intensifies when they realize their usual tools of manipulation and control have no effect on someone who has genuinely moved beyond caring about their approval, attention, or presence. Their strategic emotional distance, which once generated pursuit, now generates indifference. Their calculated unavailability, which once created artificial scarcity, now creates actual absence that their former partner has learned to fill with sources of satisfaction that don't include them. This pursuit often includes attempts to recreate the emotional intensity that characterized the relationship's beginning, as the avoidant tries to remind their former partner of their connection's peak moments while conveniently ignoring the months or years of emotional neglect that followed. They become archaeologists of their own relationship, excavating evidence of love they systematically buried through their defensive patterns and emotional unavailability. The desperate pursuit also reveals the avoidant's complete lack of emotional skills for winning someone back, as they've never had to develop strategies for rebuilding connection they've damaged through their own choices. They approach the situation with the same emotional tools that created the problem: control, manipulation, strategic thinking, rather than the vulnerability, accountability, and genuine change that actual reconciliation would require. Most tragically, the pursuit often becomes increasingly aggressive and invasive as the avoidance panic escalates, transforming from romantic gestures into harassment that further validates their former partner's decision to maintain distance. Their inability to accept rejection with grace reveals the emotional immaturity that made sustaining the relationship impossible in the first place, confirming their former partner's wisdom in walking away. The pursuit becomes particularly desperate when the avoidant realizes their former partner has begun dating someone else, when their irrelevance becomes concrete rather than theoretical, when they must confront evidence that someone else can provide the emotional presence and availability they never offered. This competition triggers possessive instincts they never expressed during the relationship, revealing depths of attachment they concealed until it was too late to matter. Understanding this desperation explains why avoidant pursuit often feels manipulative rather than romantic to recipients who remember months or years of emotional distance and unavailability. The sudden intensity of their effort highlights the casual indifference they previously showed, making their desperate pursuit feel like emotional manipulation designed to restore their control rather than genuine recognition of what they lost. The desperate pursuit ultimately serves as the avoidance education in emotional vulnerability, teaching them through direct experience the very feelings they inflicted on their partner through their emotional unavailability, creating a painful but necessary understanding of what it means to need someone who doesn't need you back. How they misinterpret your indifference as a game. The avoidance psychological framework cannot initially process genuine indifference as authentic emotional state, instead interpreting your lack of interest as sophisticated manipulation designed to provoke their attention and restore the power dynamic that favored their emotional unavailability. Their wounded ego requires them to believe that your indifference represents strategic withdrawal rather than genuine disengagement, that your peace represents performance rather than authentic emotional resolution. This misinterpretation operates through the avoidance projection of their own manipulative strategies onto your behavior, assuming that your newfound indifference serves the same purpose their emotional distance served, creating artificial scarcity to increase their perceived value and generate pursuit from someone who previously held the power position. They cannot fathom that someone might genuinely stop caring rather than strategically pretending not to care for tactical advantage. Understanding this misinterpretation reveals why avoidants often respond to your indifference with amusement, condescension, or confident predictions that you'll come back once you realize your mistake. They interpret your emotional distance as amateur hour compared to their sophisticated withdrawal techniques, believing they can wait out your supposed manipulation until you crack under the pressure of not receiving their attention. The game theory mindset prevents the avoidant from recognizing authentic emotional transformation, as they've become so accustomed to relationships operating through strategic emotional management that they cannot conceive of someone simply losing interest without ulterior motive. Your indifference must be performance, because genuine indifference would mean they've lost something valuable, which conflicts with their narrative about being the prize rather than the pursuer. This misinterpretation becomes most evident when the avoidant responds to your indifference with their own escalated emotional distance, believing they can outmanipulate your supposed manipulation through superior strategic withdrawal. They engage in imaginary competition for who can care less, not realizing they're competing alone while you've genuinely moved on to sources of satisfaction that don't include them. The game framework also explains why avoidants often become frustrated or angry when their countermoves fail to generate your expected response, when their strategic behaviors produce no emotional reaction because you're no longer invested in the outcome of their emotional chess match. They discover they're playing a game where the other player has not only left the board, but forgotten the game exists. Most significantly, the misinterpretation protects the avoidant from confronting the reality that their emotional unavailability has genuine consequences, that their manipulation tactics can actually destroy rather than control relationships, that their strategic emotional distance can push people beyond the point of caring rather than creating the artificial scarcity they intended to maintain. The inability to recognize authentic indifference also prevents the avoidant from taking appropriate action to repair the relationship, as they waste precious time waiting for your supposed strategy to fail rather than addressing the behavioral changes and emotional availability that might restore your interest if it weren't already too late. Understanding this misinterpretation explains why avoidants often seem shocked when your indifference proves permanent, when months pass without you attempting to restore contact, when you demonstrate through consistent behavior that your lack of interest represents genuine emotional state rather than temporary tactical position in an ongoing power struggle. The game theory interpretation ultimately reveals the avoidant's fundamental inability to conceive of relationships outside the framework of power, control, and strategic emotional management, preventing them from understanding that healthy people eventually stop playing games and start seeking authentic connection with partners capable of genuine emotional reciprocity. The misinterpretation becomes most tragic when the avoidant finally realizes your indifference is real, when they understand too late that what they dismissed as amateur manipulation was actually someone processing disappointment and choosing self-respect over continued participation in a relationship that provided emotional scraps rather than genuine nourishment and mutual satisfaction. The shock of discovering you have other options. The avoidance worldview crumbles when they realize you possess genuine alternatives to their inconsistent attention, that your life contains sources of validation, companionship, and satisfaction that operate independently of their sporadic emotional availability. This discovery represents a fundamental threat to their psychological security system, which depends on maintaining the illusion that you need them more than they need you, that your happiness requires their participation, that your emotional well-being cannot survive without access to their carefully rationed affection and attention. The shock intensifies when they observe you thriving in their absence, when your social media reflects genuine joy rather than desperate attempts to make them jealous, when mutual friends report that you seem happier and more relaxed without the constant stress of managing their emotional unavailability and defensive patterns. The evidence that you can not only survive but flourish without them shatters their comfortable assumption that they represented the best option available to someone of your supposed emotional neediness. Understanding this shock means recognizing that the avoidant has unconsciously organized their entire relationship strategy around the premise that their partner lacks better alternatives, that their limited emotional investment represents a generous gift to someone who should be grateful for any attention, rather than demanding the reciprocity and consistency that healthy relationships require. your options eliminate their sense of superiority and special status. The discovery becomes most devastating when they realize other people find you attractive, interesting, and worthy of genuine emotional investment in ways they never demonstrated despite months or years of your devoted attention. When they see you receiving the consistent care, appreciation, and respect they withheld, they confront the reality that their treatment of you reflected their limitations rather than your value or worthiness of better treatment. This shock often triggers the avoidant's first genuine experience of jealousy and possessive anxiety, emotions they've typically avoided through emotional distance but cannot suppress when confronting concrete evidence that someone else recognizes and appreciates what they took for granted. They discover that their casual indifference has made you available to people who understand your worth better than they ever did. The realization that you have options also forces the avoidant to confront their own replaceability, shattering their grandiose self-perception as uniquely valuable and irreplaceable in your life. When they see you connecting with people who provide emotional availability, consistency, and genuine interest in your well-being, they realize they offered nothing that cannot be found elsewhere in superior quality and greater abundance. Most significantly, discovering your options eliminates the avoidant's ability to maintain their comfortable position of emotional superiority, as they can no longer pretend that your attachment to them reflected their exceptional qualities rather than your capacity for love and loyalty that they systematically exploited and undervalued. Your alternatives prove that attachment to them was choice rather than necessity. The shock deepens when they recognize that your other options include people who are not only more emotionally available but also more attractive, successful, or interesting than they are, forcing them to confront their own ordinariness and the delusional nature of their belief that you were lucky to have their attention rather than them being fortunate to receive your love. Understanding this discovery explains why avoidants often become most invested in relationships just as they're ending, when the prospect of their partner finding better treatment elsewhere forces them to confront what they're losing and their own role in creating that loss through emotional unavailability and systematic devaluation of what was freely offered. The option shock ultimately serves as harsh education in market dynamics, teaching the avoidant that emotional scarcity only creates value when the scarce resource is actually valuable, that withdrawal only generates pursuit when what's being withdrawn is worth pursuing, that their strategic unavailability has simply made room for people who understand that love shared freely multiplies rather than diminishes in value. Their attempt to reclaim what they never valued. The avoidant's sudden campaign to reclaim your attention represents a profound psychological reversal where they attempt to win back something they systematically devalued, pursuing someone they treated as disposable, fighting for a connection they consistently undermined through emotional distance and strategic unavailability. This reclamation effort emerges not from newfound appreciation of your worth, but from narcissistic injury at losing control over someone they assumed would remain perpetually available despite their negligent treatment. The attempt typically begins with casual overtures designed to test whether you'll respond to minimal effort, as the avoidant hopes to restore their position of power without acknowledging their role in destroying the relationship or making meaningful changes to their emotional availability. They expect to reclaim your attention through the same low-investment strategies that maintained it previously, not understanding that someone who has truly moved on requires entirely different approaches. Understanding this reclamation reveals its fundamentally selfish nature, as the avoidant seeks to restore their sense of security and control rather than rebuild a relationship for mutual benefit and satisfaction. They want you back not because they've recognized your value, but because losing you threatens their self-image as someone who doesn't need anyone while simultaneously being needed by others. who cannot easily replace them. The reclamation effort often includes revisionist history, where the avoidant attempts to minimize their emotional unavailability while maximizing any positive moments from the relationship, creating a narrative where their behavior was reasonable and your departure represents overreaction or inability to appreciate their unique form of love. They rewrite the past to justify their present panic about losing what they never properly valued. This attempt becomes most pathetic when the avoidant offers changes they could have made months or years earlier, promising emotional availability they withheld, when such availability could have built intimacy rather than served as desperate attempts to prevent loss. Their sudden willingness to provide what you always needed reveals how little effort genuine change would have required if they had cared enough to make it when it mattered. The reclamation strategy also includes attempts to exploit your previous attachment by reminding you of your emotional investment, trying to guilt you into giving them another chance based on the time and energy you invested rather than their worthiness of continued investment. They weaponize your own capacity for love against you, using your former devotion as leverage for renewed attention. Most manipulatively, the avoidant often presents their reclamation efforts as romantic gestures rather than acknowledging them as desperate attempts to restore their psychological comfort zone, where they held power through emotional scarcity while you provided effort through pursuit. They frame their panic as love rather than admitting their terror of being rejected by someone they consistently rejected. The attempt to reclaim what they never valued becomes particularly aggressive when the avoidant realizes their initial overtures have failed, escalating from casual contact to intensive pursuit that reveals the emotional capacity they always possessed but withheld during the relationship. This escalation often feels manipulative rather than romantic because it demonstrates deliberate choice in their previous unavailability. Understanding this reclamation explains why it typically fails to achieve its intended goal, as someone who has genuinely moved on recognizes these efforts as crisis management rather than authentic change, as attempts to restore control rather than build genuine connection, as temporary panic rather than sustainable transformation of emotional availability and relationship priorities. The tragic irony lies in how the avoidance reclamation efforts often reveal their true capacity for emotional investment at precisely the moment when such investment can no longer repair the damage their emotional withholding created, proving they always could have provided what you needed but chose not to, until losing you threatened their sense of power and control rather than your mutual happiness and satisfaction.